Welcome to Hampden-Hampshire's Conservation District's Winter Workshop Series on native plants. Tonight's talk is by Amy Meltzer. Amy is on the steering committee of the Mass Pollinator Network. She's an active member of Grow Native Massachusetts and is on the research team of Elders Climate Action. She's been researching and growing native plants for over 10 years, and tonight's presentation is titled Beyond Flowering Plants, Helping Pollinators Thrive Year-Round. Welcome, Amy.
Thanks so much, Megan, and thanks for running this terrific program. There are just so many great aspects to it that are educational and practical. So thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to be talking about not only the importance of growing native plants, but how we need to take care of our landscapes through the whole year so that we're really supporting the life cycle of the species that need our help so that they will continue to thrive. And let me switch here. Here we go. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the biodiversity crisis because that is really what is making it urgent that we change our gardening practices. I'll be talking about ecology in the garden, how many different species are interdependent and really need each other for survival and health. And I'll be talking about choosing plants so that they can thrive in your garden. And then I'm going to be talking about maintaining your garden through the year, through all the seasons, so that we're really supporting all these different species so they can live and reproduce and, keep coming back year after year. At the end, I have a lot of resource slides, which I will just show you very quickly, but Megan is going to send out a PDF of those slides after the talk, not tonight, but soon. And then you'll have access to many different resources. So ecological gardening is particularly important now because we are in a serious biodiversity crisis. According to the UN scientists, it's actually as dire as the climate crisis, but we really hear a lot less about it. So we've lost almost 3 billion birds in North America in a little more than 50 years. Around the world, there are 1 million animal and plant species that are at risk of extinction, many of them within decades. And a major reason for the decline in the bird population is a loss of insects, that insects are declining very rapidly, and both adult birds and their offspring rely on insects for food. Around the world, 41% of insect species are declining. So this is the bad news, but the good news part is the action that we can take to help reverse this. Native plants are important to the survival of insects and other species because they have been evolving together for 125 million years. So that plants depend on insects to pollinate them in order for the plants to be able to reproduce. Insects depend on plants for food, both for adults and for their offspring. And this has resulted in very specialized relationships so that 90% of insects need specific plants for food and can't survive or reproduce without them. And most plants can only be pollinated by limited species of insects. In contrast to the benefits of native plants in an ecosystem, plants that are imported from other ecoregions or other continents, and most plants that have been hybridized, so that means plants that have been altered by humans so that they have particular traits that maybe you might enjoy having in your garden, most of those provide little to no benefit to insects. So I want to, actually, I guess I have that on another slide. Yeah, here's my definitions. People define native differently. There's sort of different geographical choices about how you want to define that. Some people want to use plants from their county, their state, their ecoregion, plants from New England, plants from east of the Mississippi. So the important thing is, it's fine to be as particular about that, but I think the most important thing is that the plants have evolved with other species and that they can provide support to them so that they have a positive interaction with insects. And not just the most common insects, but the ones that are at risk of extinction, the ones that are declining in numbers. So some of the resources in the slides that you'll get will tell you which which plants provide the most benefit. Non-native plants are plants that have been imported from other continents or just other regions. Like California is part of the US, but the conditions are very different. The species that evolve there together are different and have different relationships than the ones we have here. So even plants that were brought here hundreds of years ago don't provide the same support to insects that plants do that evolved with those insects. Invasive plants are very aggressive non-native plants that crowd out native plants. They might smother them, they might poison them underground, and they just take over territory, and um, they make it hard for plants to survive because they're really taking over their habitat, plants and insects and other species. So the way that native plants provide ecosystem support are they produce nectar that adult insects eat. They produce pollen and leaves that feed the offspring of insects, and I'll be explaining that. If you leave the plants standing, which I'll be talking about, they'll develop seed that feed birds. And because they're pollinated by insects carrying pollen from one plant to another, they have genetic variability, which is a huge advantage anytime, but especially now during climate change where we have so many adverse events. And if some plants have different characteristics from others, it might allow them to withstand a heat wave or a drought. Whereas if they were all exactly genetically the same, they might all get wiped out. And in contrast, many non-native plants and hybridized plants provide little to no ecosystem support. So this is a picture of a highly hybridized echinacea plant, which is decorative, but that's all it is. It has no interaction with other species in the region. It has no pollen, it has no nectar, and it has no seeds. It was really hybridized just for its visual qualities. Other plants that are less intensely hybridized or brought here from other regions have reduced nutrition in their nectar and pollen. Some of them have shapes that have been altered that make them inaccessible to pollinators, like long tubular flowers might be made bigger, and then the insects that have long tongues can't reach the nectar, so they're basically become non-functional ecologically. And then these plants are usually cloned. Even the ones that are just native to other regions, it's just convenient for nurseries to have exactly the same plant. They know exactly how it's going to grow, and they know what their customers are getting. So again, this puts them at risk of being wiped out in an adverse weather event. So supporting insects is really important because they are essential aspects of every ecosystem. They pollinate many food crops so that much of the fresh produce we eat is a result of vegetable plants or fruit plants being pollinated by insects. Insects pollinate 90% of flowering plants. They are food for many species, and many of the species that eat insects are in turn eaten by other species. So they're really a fundamental part of the food web. I actually heard an amazing statistic recently. Moths and butterflies produce thousands more eggs than ever grow up into being adult moths and butterflies. Grizzly bears, this is out in the Pacific Northwest, eat 10 to 20,000 moth and butterfly larvae a day as a major part of their diet during the summer. So it's kind of amazing what insects are doing and how much life they're supporting. And the biggest the biggest reason for the decline in insect populations is habitat loss, which comes in many forms. It's agricultural fields that are, soaked with pesticides and only have one kind of plant growing in them. It's deforestation, which takes away habitat that many species depend on. It's, the development we do where we're paving over soil. So there are definitely great opportunities in cities to grow ecologically beneficial gardens. But, whenever we're paving something, we're taking away habitat. And then another kind of habitat loss is the widespread use of non-native plants. As I was talking about, they don't provide ecosystem support, And many conventional nurseries have nothing but non-native plants, and many of our gardens are full of non-native plants. So that's another kind of habitat loss. They're not feeding our insects and birds and other species. So I'm going to talk about what ecological gardening is about. A sustainable ecosystem, and this could be in your own yard, involves many species that interact and depend on each other. And over thousands and millions of years, nature has evolved so that there's a natural creation of healthy systems that support many species so that it provides shelter, it provides food, it provides water, it provides habitat that's conducive to reproduction and different species being able to reproduce and come back year after year. So we can create these conditions in our gardens that will allow these species to depend on each other and function in a healthy way and be able to come back year after year. So this is a picture of a garden in winter that was not cleaned up in the fall. And I'll explain to you why that's important. I like this picture because it illustrates that. And for me, it also shows how beautiful that can be, not cutting everything down and clearing it out. So ecological gardens will offer more than flowering plants. And Doug Tallamy is an entomologist that I hope you've heard of. If you haven't, it's really worth listening to his talks and finding his books. He did this groundbreaking research about this important relationship between native plants and insects. And he said, in the past, we have asked one thing of our gardens, that they be pretty. Now they have to support life, sequester carbon, feed pollinators, and manage water. And in conventional gardening, usually the goal is to be visually pleasing or just convenient for humans. And there's usually no attempt to benefit other species. So here's a couple examples. A conventionally cared for lawn has, one non-native grass growing in it. Often there's pesticides or herbicides used on it, and there's just nothing supporting other species. And here's an example of a Siberian iris, which is an imported and hybridized plant. And I used to have these in my garden because it's beautiful. I used to enjoy looking for different colors and different shapes. And then I started hearing about this biodiversity crisis and the decline in insects and the need for native plants. And I gave them away. It's pretty, but I want a garden that's really functioning to support life. So Doug Tallamy, the entomologist I just mentioned, has a website called Homegrown National Park, and actually it's getting more and more resources added to it. It's a great place to visit. So he's suggesting if we planted half of our lawns with at least 70% native habitat, we would really provide the support that all these species need that are now endangered. So this is an example from west of Boston. This yard used to be just nothing but grass, and the homeowner added all kinds of native trees and shrubs and flowering plants and grasses, and it will become, terrific habitat. Now that's a large example, and if you can do that, that's wonderful. If you don't have the space or the money or the time or whatever constraints you might have, you can start much smaller than that. In terms of dealing with lawns, you could look at them and see what do you actually use for recreation, for walking paths, and whatever you're not actively using, you have the opportunity to turn it into habitat. But you can also start with a small area. When I started learning about this, I had a very decorative garden, and then I started learning about the importance of native plants. So I just started, whenever I had a hole in the garden, I'd put in a native plant. I just committed to that's all I would add to it. Eventually I got rid of my non-native plants, but you can start small. You can even start with a window box of native plants. Anything you add is going to be beneficial. And the ways that gardening with native plants supports life through, you're putting in plants that will support insects, and I'll explain how to do this. You can use maintenance techniques that go through the whole year that will support life and will support the interdependence of all the organisms in your little ecosystem. And this kind of gardening, once the plants are established, any young plant needs frequent watering until develops a good root system. But once your plants are established, it can be pretty low maintenance. And you also have aesthetic choices. I mean, there are native plant gardens that look kind of wild and meadowy, but there are also so many different kinds of native plants. Some of them grow in tidy clumps and stay put. And you can choose those, or you can choose plants that will reseed and spread by roots. You have a big choice of what your garden will look like. So when you're choosing native plants, you want to choose the plants that will thrive in your site conditions. So some of the conventional non-native plants that you would get in a garden center will grow anywhere under any conditions, like vinca or English ivy. You just stick them in, you don't have to worry about it. For native plants, it's good to pick plants that will grow in the conditions you have. So that will keep the plants healthy, which means those plants will support other species and they'll be low maintenance. You won't have to be fussing with them. So you need to assess your site conditions, see how much sun you have. Do you have full sun, part sun? Do you have deep shade? You might have different conditions in different areas, and then you would choose different plants for different areas. You might have very dry soil or medium soil or wet soil. And there are plants, native plants with any combination of these characteristics. There's some that will grow anywhere. There's some that need sun and moist or sun and dry. Anyway, and I have made spreadsheets that make it easy for you to pick plants for different conditions. So I'll be sharing those with you too. So that's really helpful to get the right plant in the right spot. And then you want to watch your plant to see if it's happy. We're always experimenting a little bit in the garden. You're hoping you have the right plant in the right spot. It might be fine. You might see that it's not happy, that maybe it needs more light or shade, maybe the soil moisture isn't right. And then also with our changing climate, there can be change over time, or there might be change in your garden for different reasons, like a tree came down and all of a sudden you have extra light, or a tree has gotten really big and you have more shade, or a neighbor built something on top of their house and you have more shade because of that. So those are all ways that your site conditions can change. I'm going to show you an example right here that I garden in two places. One of them is in a hot, urban heat island area. And I have a shade garden right on a really hot street under a very thirsty tree. So I started noticing that my native ginger in the middle of every summer was starting to look like this. It was getting really brown and unhappy looking. And so I tried moving it to the back behind the house, which is not far away, but it's just enough cooler and moisture that it's growing really well there. It's fine. So you want to be thinking about having the right spot for your plant and the right plant for your spot, and watch, because you may have to change things over time. Also, what I ended up doing in the front was researching highly drought resistant plants and planting them there. And those are doing well too, even with the really brutal conditions we've been having recently. So now I'm going to talk about different elements of ecological gardening. This is a garden in Cummington at the Wing and a Prayer plant nursery, which is a great place to visit. So a major aspect of life supporting habitat is food. And this is probably the one we think about the most. It's, having flowering plants that are going to produce pollen and nectar. But there's some variations on that that are good to know so you can make it as beneficial as possible. So you want to choose a variety of native plants that will bloom from spring through fall. So Massachusetts has about 400 different kinds of native bees, and also all kinds of moths and butterflies. They all have different life cycles, different life habits. They emerge from hibernation or from eggs at different times. So covering the whole season, this is if you have room. I'm talking about the ideal. If you have less room, you do less, and that's fine. But this is, if you have the space to do this, to have plants blooming through the entire growing season. If you plant in groups of 3 to 5, that's enjoyable for us to see masses of color. It also helps native bees. So honeybees, I didn't say anything earlier about honeybees. I usually do. Honeybees are not native. They're not at risk, and they actually compete with native bees for resources. So one of the ways they differ from native bees is that they can fly 5 miles to find food. Native bees can only go hundreds of yards at most. So if you have masses of plants, it makes it much easier for them to conserve energy and feed, in one area at a time. So I'm going to talk in a little bit about keystone plants. Those are native plants that support large numbers of different species. There's also plants that support the endangered species in Massachusetts. I'll be giving you resources about that. And then if you aim to grow 70% native biomass, then that also provides the most benefit. So here's a little bit more about keystone plants. About 5% of native plant species feed 75% of insect species. So those are great plants to start with. And again, I have a list of those. And then the plants that support the insects in Massachusetts that are endangered are also highly beneficial. And I'll give you resources for that too. I will put this slide in the resource slide. So this just shows you some examples of keystone plants. There's trees, there's herbaceous plants and shrubs. If you think about it, trees have lots of foliage, so they're providing a lot of food. So those are really important to include. And then you'll get this list of keystone plants. So one of the important things we can do in our garden is provide food for the next generation. And this is how the reproductive cycles work for moths and butterflies. They lay eggs on leaves. When the eggs hatch, the caterpillars eat the leaves. There are thousands of caterpillars needed as food for just one nest of baby birds. So you need a lot of leaves. That's why trees and shrubs are so important. And the majority of caterpillars can only eat the leaves of specific plant species. So this is an example. This is a spice bush butterfly. It lays its eggs on the spice bush, and then its caterpillars, that's the only leaf the caterpillar can eat. So the spice bush is the host plant for the spice bush butterfly. Milkweed is an example you may know about, that monarchs lay their eggs on milkweed plants, and their caterpillars can only survive on milkweed leaves, so that's the host plant for monarch butterflies. And then bees are similar. So again, in contrast to honeybees, which we know live in big hives, there's tens of thousands of them that live together. Most native bees are solitary. They dig tunnels in the ground, they dig tunnels in wood, and they will collect pollen and lay an egg next to a pollen ball in their nest. And when the eggs hatch, the larvae eat the pollen. And most bees can only eat pollen from certain plants, similar to the specificity of butterflies and moths. So to keep these populations going, to have a sustainable ecosystem, we need to provide host plants for them. And here's the research showing why we need at least 70% native plant biomass. Desiree Narango is a student of Doug Tallamy's. She found that chickadees, little birds, need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one nest. And if the native biomass in the area, she was mostly looking at trees, fell below 70%, there wasn't enough native plant material to feed the caterpillars that would feed the birds. So that's why it's a good idea to aim for a minimum of 70% native biomass and to include trees and shrubs. And an aspect of that, this means that caterpillars are going to be eating the leaves in your garden. So that's kind of exciting. When I see that now, I don't worry about it. I just know that a moth or a butterfly larva is eating that leaf, and it will either become a pollinating insect or it will become food for birds. So it's good news. And you can see that the tree that branches from is this very healthy birch tree over here. So it's not destructive, it's just part of how nature balances itself and how these different species provide benefit to each other. So another important aspect of supporting life in your garden is providing water. So if you don't have a natural water source there or nearby, You can have a dish. It's helpful to have pebbles in it so insects can stand on it to drink. Birds can drink from it. And if you just refresh the water every few days, you won't be breeding mosquitoes and you'll keep the water clean. Another aspect of life supporting habitat in your garden is to minimize night light. There's a lot of research coming out about this now. And if you think about it, everything on Earth evolved with dark skies at night. There'd be cycles of the moon, but other than that, there was no light shining, a little bit from stars. So the change that we've made is really not good for anyone's health. It's not good for human health. It's really dangerous for insects and birds. So what you can do about that is if you can leave light off outside, that's ideal. If that's not comfortable, you can use bulbs that lean towards the yellow end of the spectrum rather than cold blue. Use low wattage, and you can put your lights on motion sensors and just make sure they shine only where you really need them. And be aware of the light that's shining through your windows at night too. I find that annoying to think about, but I realize I'm probably hurting the pollinators that I'm trying to attract to my garden. So I'm trying to think about, shutting that off. There are many, many pollinators out at night. And so they need safe conditions too. And then another aspect of having a safe life-supporting habitat is avoiding chemicals. So no matter what the pesticide companies tell you, their products kill insects indiscriminately. They can't just target ticks. They'll kill anything they come in contact with. Herbicides kill the plants that insects depend on for food. And these chemicals, as well as chemical fertilizers, get into the ground and poison the bees and other organisms that live there. They get into our waterways and damage life in the water. And there are many, many organisms that live in the soil, and it's really detrimental to that life as well. And many of the chemicals will last for years in soil and plants. So if you're shopping for native plants at a native plant nursery, you're safe. If you're shopping for native plants at a conventional nursery, it's really helpful to ask them if their plants have been treated with chemicals and if their suppliers know if they've been treated with chemicals, and tell them you don't want that. Either they will have the plants you want, or they will, as I start hearing from customers that that's what we're looking for, there are more companies that are now avoiding, especially using neonics, which are the ones that last the longest. So it's good to bring it up. And another aspect of healthy soil is that, actually, I was just talking about chemicals. I'm introducing soil here. Soil is really important. It's really kind of one of the fundamental aspects of healthy life on Earth. It supports 95% of our food. It supports global biodiversity. Soil is really important for storing atmospheric carbon underground. It's really actually limiting the damage of climate change. Soil supports many species above and below ground. It increases the nutritional value of our food. And there's research showing that when humans touch soil, healthy soil, walking on it, getting your hands dirty, it gives you a mood boost, which maybe is why so many of us like to garden. And it improves overall human and mental health, physical and mental health. And that is my grandchild who's older now, but he is learning a lot about plants and has fun hanging out in the garden. So mycorrhizal fungi are another aspect of healthy soil. They are these vast networks of fibers underground that are on every continent. And when they're reproducing is when mushrooms pop up. So they connect to 95% of plant species. They connect to roots of plants. They do an amazing job of transferring nutrients between plants, transferring water, storing carbon, protecting plants from disease. There's a book in the resource slides called Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard, and she just did fascinating research about this and has wonderful stories about, just amazing stories about how these organisms interact and support each other. They don't photosynthesize, so they're getting nutrients from plants. So again, it's this mutually beneficial cycle. And they're just really important to functioning ecosystems. So the way to protect soil health is to minimize tilling or digging to avoid breaking up these fungal connections and also avoid damaging bee nests. Now, obviously, if you're planting something or weeding, you're going to just disrupt the soil. You can't totally avoid it, but just disrupt it as little as possible. Again, avoid using chemicals because, those will damage the life in the soil. Leaving fallen leaves is really important. I mean, that's one of the amazing things about nature. Leaves grow, they have all kinds of functions, and one of them is to fall and decompose into the ground and provide mulch and fertilizer, and they just break down into really important nutrients that help keep the soil and other plants healthy. Native plants almost never require soil amendments. I mean, they just are used to growing in whatever soil is around, wherever they evolved. If you're growing vegetables, you need to enrich the soil. There are non-native plants that need enriched soil, like some roses, but it's pretty rare to need to add something to the soil for native plants. It's also helpful to plant many different plant species. The more variety there is, the healthier the plants are, and the more carbon gets stored in the soil. And then always I come back to removing invasive plants. They just disrupt everything. So here's another aspect of a very important aspect of supporting life in your garden, and that's providing shelter. So as I was comparing native bees to honeybees, different from honeybees, 90% of native bees are solitary and do not live in hives. 70% of native bees nest in the ground and they need access to bare soil. So there's a picture of a native bee coming out of its nest that it's made. 30% of native bees will nest in cavities. That could be in dead wood, in hollow stems, which I'll be talking about, or in brush piles. Bumblebees will nest in cavities in trees or underground. Sometimes they'll use abandoned tunnels that rodents have made. And they'll also find sheltered areas under dried, hummocks of grass, piles of dry leaves, piles of twigs and branches that you've cut down, and they'll dig under there to find a safe place to create a nest in the ground. So now I'm going to talk about how to maintain this cycle of life in your garden through the seasons. And I'm starting in fall because I think that's where the biggest change in habit is required. So, here's some dried stems in the fall. There's some plant stems still standing in snow in the winter. On the left, I'm sorry, on the right, there's some Virginia bluebells coming up in the spring. And then at the bottom, kind of the riot of color that we expect and get in the summertime. So fall is a good time for planting, which is true for any kind of plant. It's cooler, it tends to be moister unless we're having a terrible drought. Same reason, good time to transplant. And what the biggest change is for longtime gardeners is learning to not clean up, to leave all this plant life standing. And again, I was talking about all the ways that insects and also birds and amphibians, many species, find shelter in what nature leaves lying around. So if you have room, leaving rocks, dead and living trees. I mean, obviously, if you have a dead tree near a house, you might want to take it down or make sure the branches are off. Brush piles, leaf piles, tree limbs, everything nature has left can provide shelter and also be a source of food. If you're concerned about your neighbors with this change in garden maintenance, there are ways to make the edges look tidy, and you can also put up a pollinator sign, and people might talk to you and be curious and want to know what you're doing. So in the fall, the benefits of leaving the leaves are that there'll be shelter for insects. As I was saying, they may actually fall out of the tree in the leaves, already, starting to hibernate in the leaves and land on the ground. And if you leave the leaves there, they will go through their life cycle and emerge again in the spring. So if you're cleaning all those leaves out, you're really throwing away next year's generation of insects. And so it's kind of nice to have a little garden under a tree because it provides what people call a soft landing. You're not worried about mowing it or leaves smothering your lawn. There's actually plants there that will, give them a nice place to shelter in the leaves during the winter. And because birds eat insects, it's forage for the birds. They'll go pecking through looking for food. The leaves are a wonderful mulch. They will, insulate the roots underground during the cold weather and help the plants get through the winter. And then because you're not spending all that time cleaning up, you have more time for other things. So leaving the plant stems, again, is providing shelter. There are insects that themselves will hibernate in plant stems. Many lay eggs in the plant stems. If you leave the plant stems up, they will develop seed that birds can eat. And they'll also develop seeds that can create new plants. So there's several ways to do that. One is just to let them fall, and some of them will reproduce, and you can decide if you want to keep them or add more space in your garden with them or give them away or compost them if you really have too many. You can also, there are now groups that are getting together and gathering seed from native plant gardens and having seed swaps and learning how to grow them from seed, in containers in the winter and then sharing them in the spring. And then again, I think another reason to leave them standing is they're beautiful. I know it takes getting used to if you're used to thinking that a tidy garden and a responsible gardener, takes out all the dead material every fall. It's a real change in perspective and a change in habit. But if you can do it, it has these benefits for nature. And I also think you start learning to see the beauty in all these different textures and shapes and subtle colors. So winter, you've left everything standing. And again, there's a new kind of beauty there. And, that's a good time to dream about spring. There isn't much to do. Sometimes there's some trees that are best to prune during the dormant period in winter, but mostly it's a resting time. And then spring is a good time to manage the leaves and the plant stems that you left up in the fall. I'll get to that in a minute. We know it's a great time to plant because it's cooler and moister. It's a good time to transplant. So this is actually the front garden that I replanted with drought-resistant plants. So that's a picture of a spring planting of drought-resistant native plants. And then spring is a good time to start changing your mowing practices. So I'll get to more details about that. So managing the leaves that you've left. This is part of my backyard. So I would, clean the leaves off of the walkway where they got blown. I'd clean that branch up. And then to provide the most benefit for your plants, if you have really thick layers of wet leaves, you want to move them away from the plant crowns so they don't rot them. There are plants that have evolved in forests where they're used to coming up through leaves, but unless you know that's what you have, it's better to be safe and give them some breathing room. You can leave leaves between the plants because again, they're mulch, they're fertilizer, and they help keep the ground moist. If you have too many, you can either move them to another area or create a leaf pile where they'll decompose and they just make the best mulch and fertilizer. And then if you have a little space to leave some bare soil, that's helpful for the ground nesting bees. And then managing the plant stems that you left up. So this actually isn't spring because I didn't think to take pictures of it last spring, but I will this year. So these are plant stem. I just took this picture the other day, but I'm gonna, when spring comes, when the temperatures get consistently around 50 degrees in the day, I will cut these to 12 or 15 inches. And there may still be eggs or insects hibernating in those stalks. So I move them and stack them to the side just in case there's still life in there. And plants will grow up around the stubble that you've left. So they will completely cover it. And that's pretty much all you need to do. Now you have choices about this. If you're worried about the aesthetics, there may be certain areas that you want to keep tidier and more conventional looking. So that's totally up to you. If you want to cut things shorter or cut them earlier in a place where lots of people are walking by and then leave a more private place in the back a little wilder, you definitely, that's all your decision making. And then this is just a little picture of ground covers that start to come up in the spring. That's Carex pennsylvanica, which is a really nice short native grass, and some wild strawberry. Those are terrific ground covers and also very beneficial. So I talked about changing mowing practices. So probably most people have heard about no mow May. But this is how to take care of your yard really through the whole growing season. Take care of any lawn that you have. So if you look at the picture, the left side has clover and other plants growing in it, and that will support insects. And the right side is mown too short for anything to flower. So the best way to manage a lawn so that it's going to support other species is to mow every 2 to 3 weeks. Let the grass get 3 or 4 inches high or even a little taller. Research is showing that you do not get more ticks in taller lawns than you get in short lawns, so you don't need to worry about that. You can leave the grass clippings because they're fertilizer. Again, avoid all artificial chemicals. And you can add plants to the lawn or just let them come in. Even dandelions have pollen that's beneficial for early insects. But clover might show up, self-heal, violets, bluets. Um, there's a lot of plants that are really helpful for the early emerging insects that are starting to build nests and need a lot of pollen and nectar. And what will happen is pollinating insects will come to your lawn if you have flowers in it, and birds will follow because birds like to eat insects. So in what may have looked kind of, smooth and green and nice, but kind of sterile, becomes a little wildlife area, and that's very beneficial and enjoyable. So I'll give you this slide in the packet. It shows you which plants you can plant in your lawn or allow to come up spontaneously in your lawn, and which ones you should take out because they're going to be too aggressive and take over or because they're toxic. And then at the bottom, there's a link to the Wild Seed Project, which has an online handout on how to diversify your lawn, which has more information in it and is very helpful. So now we come to summer. And again, you can keep planting as long as it's not too hot. It's hard to keep new plants going if we're having a drought and a lot of heat because they just need so much water and it stresses them. It uses up our water. So I prefer not to plant when it's hot out. It's definitely a time to keep your new plants watered because they're developing their root systems. It's a time to mow less frequently. And it's a time just to look around and see how things are doing. Are your plants happy where you have them? Are they growing in the right spot? Do you like them where you have them? You can start making plans about things you might thin or you might move. And this is definitely a time to enjoy what's growing and enjoy the insects and birds that are coming to your yard. So I'm just coming back to fall because that's where we need to change our habits. And again, it's planting time, it's transplanting time, and it's a please don't clean up time. Just, leave everything the way it is and enjoy it and see the benefits that will follow over time. So here I'm going to go through I'm picking specific plants that you can, so you'll see how they look through the seasons, just so you have a sense of what you might see in your garden. So here's a fern, Dryopteris marginalis. These are mostly, summer and fall, the fresh looking fern, and then how it looks, as we move into fall and winter, which I just think it's beautiful. Here's some asters blooming on the left, drying out in the fall in the middle. And again, I just think those fluffy seed heads are really cool looking and the color of the leaves. And then it's very sculptural in the wintertime with snow on it. Here's goldenrod. I should say here, there are many, many species of goldenrod, different shapes. Some grow in dry soil, wet soil, some get tall, some are short. Some reproduce like mad, and there's some that don't. They just stay put. They're super beneficial plants for insects in the fall. So this is just one kind, with that particular flower shape. So again, summer, fall, winter, I just find it interesting in every stage. I mean, color is exciting and wonderful, but all these other subtle seasons are also lovely. This is Amsonia tabernamontana. There's another one that has thinner leaves. This one blooms late spring, early summer. And I have it, and I hadn't noticed any insects visiting, and I thought, is this really beneficial? And then I found out that moths visit pale colored flowers at night, and this is pollinated by moths at night when I'm asleep, so I don't see it, but it's still supporting pollinators. This is what it looks like in the fall, those kind of orangey golden leaves at the back. And here's how it looks in the winter on the right. You know, the leaves have mostly fallen off, but it's still holding snow. Here's that Carex pennsylvanica again, that very beneficial native grass, which actually can grow anywhere. There's many uses for it. And there it is in the winter, which I just think is this really cool lacy pattern. Here's some milkweed. It's 3 different species, and there's a monarch butterfly. On the lower left, that little white ball is a monarch egg. There's 2 pictures in the middle of monarch caterpillars munching away, and there's a bumblebee. The milkweeds are essential for monarch caterpillars, but the flowers provide nectar for many different species. So there's a bumblebee on one of them. And then here's how it looks in the fall and in the winter. And again, just really interesting shapes, fun to see. Here's Liatris, this kind of purpley pink poker-shaped flower. Really fun shape and great color and fun to grow with other plants. And there it is in the fall, drying out. And there it is in the winter with snow on it. Just a cool shape. You get all these different shapes in your garden after the plants dry out. And here's a native Pachysandra, Pachysandra alleghaniensis. So this picture's from the spring. I can see a little cherry blossom on one of the leaves. Here it is in the fall with leaves having fallen all around it. And there it is in the winter with covered with snow and a whole other kind of pattern and texture. So just a reminder that we are part of nature too, and we benefit when the ecosystem is healthy. And you know, we're facing these really serious environmental problems, and it can be stressful thinking about it, but this is a really joyful way to actually take action. You get all this different kind of beauty, you attract wildlife that's fun to learn about, and you're really benefiting the ecosystem. And I think it's a very joyful way to do that. So these are my resource slides. I'm going to go through very fast just so you'll see what you're getting. And please feel free to ask questions. If I don't have the answers here, I can add them to a slide and send it to Megan so she can, you know, include it in the information that's here. But this is a summary of the garden practices that support biodiversity. So I've talked about all of this. These are native plant lists and spreadsheets for different conditions. There's tons of information in here. It'll tell you, you can get pictures, bloom time, height, color, water preferences, light preferences, if it's salt resistant, tolerant, if it's rabbit resistant. I mean, nothing's rabbit proof, but some plants are rabbit and deer resistant. So there's a lot of information in here and plants for growing in different conditions. This is the slide about what you can grow in your lawn. This is some advice about what to look for when you're plant shopping, either at a nursery, in a catalog, or from a landscaper. You know, again, the straight species, pesticide-free, ideally grown from seed. And just watch out because there are places that are hopping on the bandwagon and telling you that plants are good for pollinators, but some of them are just saying that and it's not really true. So it's good to find out, you know, what plants are included in this seed mix, or, you know, what are the straight species that are on this page of Echinacea. So don't get fooled by marketing. I'm also going to send you a spreadsheet of nurseries in and near Massachusetts that carry native plants, either where you can shop directly or mail order. So I like to share this information about honeybees just so, because there's so many misconceptions. So if you're interested in that, there's articles and little videos about their impact on our ecosystem. These are places to do native plant research. So this is how I figured out what I could grow in my front yard. I've translated a lot of that information into spreadsheets, but if you want to do more original research and not just depend on the spreadsheet, these are great places to go. And there's different search terms you can use to look up plants for different conditions, or you can look up a plant that you know about and just learn more about it. And here's the spreadsheet for the endangered insects in Massachusetts and for keystone plants. So these are organizations and websites that are local. The Hampden-Hampshire Conservation District, which is hosting this talk and has all kinds of really great resources for people. The Mass Pollinator Network and Grow Native, which I'm involved with both. There's also Pollinator Pathways. These are all great places to connect with people, get educated, find resources, find books. They're all good. These are national organizations that also provide a lot of information. These are great newsletters. Some of them are really fun. They're all very informative. And these are terrific books on native plants. And once again, you'll get this slide in the resource slides. So I'm going to stop screen sharing here and say, hi, everybody. And if anyone wants to, now that I'm not sharing my screen, if anyone wants to be visible, that's fun for me. But if you don't want to, that's fine. And happy if there's any questions.
Assuming this is harmful, but wondering about the herbal yard sprays for ticks. Harmful to pollinators? Question mark.
I don't know about that. I assume if you're kind of doing, so I'm also welcome if there's people here that have an answer that, and you know more than I do, or just have something to add, I'm really happy for you to speak up. I'm guessing here. I'm assuming that if you're doing an overall spraying and it's going to be bad for one insect, it's probably going to deter others. But that really is a guess. I know I've used herbal sprays. I had wasps building little nests, right over our door near where people sat and ate. And so I would take the nest down and then I sprayed up there to deter them from coming back, but I wasn't doing an overall yard spraying. So that needs more research. Maybe I could find out more about that.
That's a great question. I've wondered about that before. We have some kind of all natural tick deterrent companies here in our area, and I've wondered about that. Well, if it deters ticks, does it deter everybody?
Yeah,
It says containing things like cedar oil, lemongrass oil, lavender oil, eucalyptus, peppermint. I guess it's more of a scent kind of thing. You know, the way some people plant marigolds next to things that they want to preserve to keep the deer or the bunnies away.
right. Yeah, I just don't know how much it's deterring and for how long. And
Right. Yeah.
so
Great question, though.
it is a great question.
All right.
Actually, that reminds me of something that I didn't mention. If you grow vegetables and you grow native flowering plants near the vegetables, it will attract predator insects that will eat some of the insects that tend to eat people's vegetables. So you'll get a bigger yield, and also they'll pollinate your vegetable plants. So you get a better yield in a vegetable garden if you have native plants near it.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Megan.